Part 1. Speaking personally. I speak as a person from a context of a personal experience and personal learnings. This is me, the development of my professional thinking and personal philosophy. This chapter combines two very personal talks. 5 years ago, I was asked to speak to the senior class at Brandeis University to present not my ideas of psychotherapy, but myself. How had I come to think the thoughts I had? How had I come to be the person I am? I found this a very thought provoking invitation, and I endeavored to meet the request of these students. During this past year, the Student Union Forum Committee at Wisconsin made a somewhat similar request. They asked me to speak in a personal vein on their last lecture series, in which it is assumed that, for reasons unspecified, the professor is giving his last lecture and therefore giving quite personally of himself. It is an intriguing comment on our educational system that it is assumed that only under the most dire circumstances would a professor reveal himself in any personal way. In this Wisconsin talk, I expressed more fully than in the first one the personal learnings or philosophical themes which have come to have meaning for me. In the current chapter 1, I have woven together both of these talks, trying to retain something of the informal character which they had in their initial presentation. The response to each of these talks has made me realize how hungry people are to know something of the person who is speaking to them or teaching them. Consequently, I have set this chapter first in the book in the hope that it will convey something of me and thus give more context and meaning to the chapter which follow. I have been informed that what I am expected to do in speaking to this group is to assume that my topic is this is me. I feel various reactions to such an invitation, but one that I would like to mention is that I feel honored and flattered that any group wants in a personal sense to know who I am. I can assure you it is a unique and challenging sort of invitation, and I shall try to give to this honest question as honest an answer as I can. So, who am I? I'm a psychologist. I'm a psychologist who whose primary interest for many years has been in psychotherapy. What does that mean? I don't intend to bore you with a long account of my work, but I would like to take a few paragraphs from the preface of my book, Client Centered Therapy, to indicate in a subjective way what it means to me. I was trying to give the reader some feeling for the subject matter of the volume, and I wrote as follows. What is the book about? What is this book about? Let me try to give an answer which may, to some degree, convey the living experience that this book is intended to be. This book is about the suffering and the hope, the anxiety and satisfaction with which each therapist's counseling room is filled. It is about the uniqueness of the relationship each therapist forms with each client, and equally about the common elements which we discover in all these relationships. This book is about the highly personal experiences of each one of us. It is about a client in my office who sits there by the corner of the desk, struggling to be himself, yet deathly afraid of being himself, striving to see his experience as it is, wanting to be that experience, and yet deeply fearful of the prospect. This book is about me as I sit there with the client, facing him, participating in that struggle as deeply and sensitively as I'm able. It is about me as I try to pursue his experience and the meaning and the feeling and the taste and the flavor that it has for him. It is about me as the bemoan my very human fallibility in understanding the client and the occasional failures to see life as it is, as it appears to him. Failures which fall like heavy objects across the intricate, delicate web of growth which is taking place. It is about me as I rejoice at the privilege of being a midwife to a new personality, as I stand by with awe at the emergence of a self, a person as I see a birth process in which I have had an important and facilitating part. It is about both the client and me as we regard with wonder the potent and orderly forces which are evident in this whole experience, forces which seem deeply rooted in the universe as a whole. The book is, I believe, about life as life vividly reveals itself in the therapeutic process with its blind power and its tremendous capacity for destruction, but with its overbalancing thrust toward growth if the opportunity for growth is provided. Perhaps that will give you some picture of what I do and the way I feel about it. I presume you may also wonder how I came to engage in that occupation and some of the decisions and choices, conscious and unconscious, which were made along the way. Let me see if I can give you some of the psychological highlights of my autobiography, particularly as it seems to relate to my professional life. My early years, I was brought up in a home marked by close family ties, a very strict and uncompromising religious and ethical atmosphere, and what amounted to a worship of virtue of hard work. I came along as the fourth of six children. My parents cared a great deal for us and had our welfare almost constantly in mind. They were also, in many subtle and affectionate ways, very controlling of our behavior. It was assumed by them and accepted by me that we were different from other people. No alcoholic beverages, no dancing, cards, or theater, very little social life, and much work. I have a hard time convincing my children that even carbonated beverages had a faintly sinful aroma, and I remember my slightly feeling of wickedness when I had my first bottle of pop, which had good times together which within the family, but we did not mix. So I was a pretty solitary boy who read incessant, incessantly, incessantly, incess, incessantly, and went all through high school with only two dates. When I was 12, my parents bought a farm and we made our home there. The reasons were twofold. My father, having become a prosperous businessman, wanted it for a hobby. When I was 12, my parents bought a farm and we made our home there. The reason were the reasons were twofold. My father, having become a prosperous businessman, wanted it for a hobby. More important, I believe, was the fact that it seemed more important, I believe, was the fact that it seemed to my parents that a growing adolescent family should be removed from the temptations of suburban life. Here I developed two interests which I have probably had some real bearing on my later work. I became fascinated by the night flying moths. Uh, Gene Stratton Potter's books were then in vogue, and I became an authority on gorgeous Luna, Polyphemus cicrophia, and other moths which inhabited our woods. I laboriously bred the moths in captivity, reared the caterpillars, kept the cocoons over the long winter months, and in general realized some of the joys of and frustrations of the scientist as he tries to observe nature. My father was determined to operate his new farm on a scientific basis, so he bought many books on scientific agriculture. He encouraged his boys to have independent and profitable ventures of our own. So my brothers and I had a flock of chickens and at one time or other reared from fancy lambs, pigs, and calves. In doing this, I became a student of scientific agriculture and have also realized in recent years what a fundamental feeling for science I gained in that way. There was no one to tell me that Morrison's feed or feeding or feeds and feeding was not a book for a 14-year-old. So I plowed through its hundreds of pages, learning how experiments were conducted, how control groups were matched with experimental groups, how conditions were held constant by randomizing procedures, so that the influence of given food on meat production or milk production could be established. I learned how difficult it is to test an hypothesis. I acquired a knowledge of and a respect for the methods of science in a field of practical endeavor. College and graduate education. I started in college at Wisconsin in field of agriculture. One of the things I remember best was the vehement statement of an agronomy professor in regard to the learning and use of facts. He stressed the futility of encyclopedic knowledge for his own sake and wound up with the injunction, don't be damned, ammunition's wagon, be a rifle. During my first 2 years of professional goals, during my first two college years, my professional goals changed as a result of some emotionally charged students' religious conferences, from that of a scientific agriculturist to that of the Ministry of Slight Shift. I changed from agriculture to history, believing this would be a better preparation. In my junior year, I was selected as one of a dozen students from this country to go to China for an international World Student Christian Federation conference. This was a most important experience for me. It was 1922, 4 years after the close of World War One. I saw how bitterly the French and the Germans still hated each other, even though as individuals they seemed very likable. I was forced to stretch my thinking to realize that sincere and honest people could believe in very divergent religious doctrines. In major ways, I, for the first time, emancipated myself from the religious thinking of my parents and realized that I could not go along with them. This independence of thought caused great pain and stress in our relationship. But looking back on it, I believe that here, more than at any other one time, I became an independent person. Of course, there was much revolt and rebellion in my attitude during that period, but the essential split was achieved during the 6 months I was on this trip to the Orient and hence was taught through away from the influence of home. Although this is an account of elements which influenced my professional development rather than my personal growth, I wish to mention very briefly one profoundly important factor in my personal life. It was about the time of my trip to China that I fell in love with a lovely girl whom I had known for many years, even in childhood. And we were married with the very reluctant consent of our parents. As soon as I finished college, in order that we could go to graduate school together, I cannot be very objective about this, but her steady and sustaining love and companionship during all the years since has been a most important and enriching factor in my life. I chose to go to Union Theological Seminar, the most liberal in the country at the time, 1924. To prepare for religious work, I have never regretted the 2 years there. I came in contact with some great scholars and teachers, notably Dr. A.C. McGiffert, who believed devoutly in the freedom of inquiry and in the following the truth no matter where it led. Knowing universities and graduate schools as I do now, knowing their rules and the rigidities, I'm truly astonished at one very significant experience at Union. A group of us left, a group of us felt that ideas were being fed to us, whereas we wished primarily to explore our own questions and doubts and find out where they led. We petitioned the administration that we be allowed to set up a seminar for credit, a seminar with no instructor where the curriculum will would be imposed on our own questions. The seminary was understandably perplexed by this, but they granted our petition. The only restriction was that, in the interest of the institution, a young instructor was to sit in on the seminar, but would take no part in it unless we wished him to be active. I suppose it is unnecessary to add that this seminar was deeply satisfying and clarifying. I feel that it moved me a long way toward a philosophy of life which was my own. The majority of the members of the group, in thinking their way through the questions they had raised, thought themselves right out of religious work. I was one. I felt that questions as to the meaning of life and the possibility of constructive improvement in life for individuals would probably always interest me. But I could not work in a field where I would be required to believe in some specified religious doctrine. My belief had already changed tremendously and might continue to change. It seemed to me it would be a horrible thing to have to profess a set of beliefs in order to maintain in one's profession. My belief had already changed tremendously and might continue to change. It seemed to me it would be a horrible thing to have to profess a set of beliefs in order to remain in one's profession. I wanted to find a field in which I would be sure of my freedom of thought would not be limited. Becoming a psychologist. But what field? I had been attracted at Union by the courses and lectures on psychological and psychiatric work, which were then beginning to develop. Goodwin Watson, Harrison Elliott, Marian Kenworthy all contributed to this interest. I began to take more courses at Teachers College, Columbia University, across the street from Union Seminary. I took work in philosophy of education with William Kilpatrick and Found him a great teacher. I began practical clinical work with children under Letta Hollingworth, a sensitive and practical person. I found myself drawn to child guidance work so that gradually, with very little painful adjustment, readjustment, sorry, with very little painful readjustment, I shifted over to the field of child guidance and began to think of myself as a clinical psychologist. It was a step I eased into with relatively free, clear cut conscious choice, rather just following the activities which interested me. While I was at Teachers College, I applied for and was granted a fellowship of or internship at the then new Institute for Child Guidance sponsored by the Commonwealth Fund. I have often been grateful that I was there during the first year. The organization was in a chaotic beginning state, but this meant that one could do what he wanted to do. I soaked up the dynamic Freudian views of the staff, which included David Levy, Lawson Laurie, and found them in great conflict with the rigorous scientific, coldly objective statistical point of view then prevalent at the teachers college. Looking back, I believe the necessity of resolving that conflict in me was a most valuable learning experience. At the time, I felt I was functioning in two completely different worlds, and never the twain shall meet. By the end of this internship, it was highly important to me that I obtain a job to support my growing family. Even though my doctorate was not completed, positions were not plentiful, and I remember the relief and exhilaration I felt when found one. I was employed as psychologist in the child study department of the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children in Rochester, New York. There were three psychologists in this department, and my salary was $2,900 per year. I look back at the acceptance of that position with amusement and some amazement. The reason I was so pleased was that it was a chance to do the work I wanted to do. That by any reasonable criterion, it was dead end street professionally. That I would be isolated from professional contacts, that the salary was not good, even by the standards of that day, seems not to have occurred to me as nearly as I can recall. I think I have always had a feeling that if I was given some opportunity to do the I think I have always had a feeling that if I was given some opportunity to do the thing I was most interested in doing, everything else would somehow take care of itself. The Rochester years. The next 12 years in Rochester were exceedingly valuable ones. For at least the first 8 of these years, I was completely immersed in carrying on practical psychological service, diagnosing and planning for the delinquent and underprivileged children who were sent to us by the courts and agencies. And in many instances, carrying on treatment interviews, it was a period of relative professional isolation where my only concern was in trying to be more effective with our clients. We had to live with our failures as well our successes, so that we were forced to learn. There was only one criterion in regard to any method of dealing with these children and their parents, and that was, does it work? Is it effective? I found I began increasingly to formulate my own views out of my everyday working experience. Three significant illustrations come to my mind, all small but important to me at the time. It strikes me that they are all instances of disillusionment with an authority, with materials, with myself. In my training, I had been fascinated with Dr. William Haley's writings indicating that delinquency was often based upon sexual conflict, and that if this conflict was uncovered, the delinquencies ceased. In my first or second year of Rochester, I worked very hard with a youthful pyromaniac who had an unaccountable impulse to set fires. Interviewing him day after day in the detention home, I gradually traced back his desire to sexual impulse regarding masturbation. Eureka, the case was solved. However, when placed on probation, he again got into the same difficulty. I remember the jolt I felt. Healy might be wrong. Perhaps I was learning something Healy didn't know. Somehow, this incident impressed me with the possibility that there were mistakes in authoritative teachings and that were there was still new knowledge to discover. The second naive discovery was of different sort. Soon after coming to Rochester's, I led a discussion group on interviewing. I discovered a published account of an interview with a parent, approximately verbatim, in which the case worked was shrewd, insightful, clever, and led the interview quite quickly to the heart of the difficulty. I was happy to use it as an illustration of good interviewing technique. Several years later, I had a similar assignment and remembered this excellent material. I hunted it up again and reread it. I was appalled. Now it seemed to me to be clever, a legalistic type of questioning by the interviewer which convicted these parents of her unconscious motives and wrung from her an admission of her guilt. I now knew from my experience that such an interview would not be of any lasting help to the parent or the child. It made me realize that I was moving away from from any approach which was coercive or pushing in clinical relationships. Not for psychological reasons, but because such approaches were never more than superficial effective. The third incident occurred several years later. I had learned to be more subtle and patient in interpreting a client's behavior to him, attempting to time it in a gentle fashion which would again accept which would gain acceptance. I had been working with a highly intelligent mother whose boy was something of a hellion. The problem was clearly her early rejection of the boy. But over many interviews, I could not help her to this insight. I drew her out, I gently pulled together the evidence she had given, trying to help her see the pattern. But we got nowhere. Finally, I gave up. I told her that it seemed we had both tried, but we had failed, and that we might as well give up our contacts. She agreed. We concluded the interview, shook hands, and she walked to the door of the office. Then she turned and asked, "Do you ever take adults for counseling here?" When I replied in the affirmative, she said, "Well, then I would like some help." She came to the chair she had left and began to pour her heart and despair about her marriage, her troubled relationship with her husband, her sense of failure and confusion, all very different from the sterile case history she had given before. Case history she had given before. Real therapy began then, and ultimately it was very successful. This incident was one of a number which helped me to experience the fact, only fully realized later, that it is the client who knows what hurts, what directions to go, what problems are crucial, what experience have been deeply buried. It began to occur to me that unless I had a need to demonstrate my own cleverness and learning, I would do better to rely upon the client for the direction of movement in the process. Psychologist or During this period, I began to doubt that I was a psychologist. The University of Rochester made it clear that the work I was doing was not psychology, and they had no interest in my teaching in psychology department. I went to meetings of the American Psychological Association and found them full of papers on learning process of rats and laboratory experiments which seemed to me to have no relation to what I was doing. The psychiatric social workers, however, seemed to be talking my language. So I became active in social work profession, moving up to local and even national offices. Only when the American Association for Applied Psychology was formed did I become did I become really active as a psychologist. I began to teach courses at university on how to understand and deal with problem children under the Department of Sociology. Soon the Department of Education wanted to classify these education courses also. Before I left Rochester, the Department of Psychology too finally requested permission to list them, thus at last accepting me as a psychologist. Simply describing these experiences make me realize how stubbornly I have followed my own course, being relatively unconcerned with the question of whether I was going with my group or not. Time does not permit to tell the work of establishing a separate guidance center in Rochester, nor the battle with some of the psychiatric profession which was included. These were largely administrative struggles which did not have too much to do with the development of my ideas. My children. It was during these Rochester years that my son and daughter grew through infancy and childhood, teaching me far more about individuals, their developments, and their relationships than I could have ever learned professionally. I don't feel I was a very good parent in their early years, but fortunately my wife was. And as time went on, I believe I gradually became better and more understanding parent. Certainly the privilege during these years and later of being in relationship with two fine sensitive youngsters through all their childhood pleasures and pain, their adolescent assertiveness and difficulties, and on into their adult years of beginning of their own families has been a priceless one. I think my wife and I regard as one of the most satisfying achievements in which we have had a part, the fact that we can really communicate in a deep way with our grown up children and their spouses, and they with us. Ohio State years. In 1940, I accepted a position at Ohio State University. I'm sure the only reason I was considered was my book on clinical treatment of the problem child, which I had squeezed out of vacation and brief leaves of absence. To my surprise and contrary to my expectation, they offered me a full professorship. I heartily recommend starting in academic world at this level. I have often been grateful that I have never had to live through the frequently degrading competitive process of step by step promotion in university faculties, where individuals so frequently learn only one lesson: not to stick their necks out. It was in trying to teach what I had learned about treatment and counseling to graduate students at Ohio State University that I first began to realize that I had perhaps developed a distinctive point of view of my own out of my experience. When I tried to crystallize some of these ideas, and present them in a paper at University of Minnesota in December 1940, I found the reactions were very strong. It was my first experience of the fact that a new idea of mine, which to me can seem all shiny and glowing with potentiality, can to another person, be a great threat. And to find myself the center of criticism of argument pro and con was disconcerting and made me doubt and question. Nevertheless, I felt I had something to contribute and wrote the manuscript of counseling and psychotherapy, settling forth what I felt to be somewhat more effective orientation to therapy. Here again, I realize with some amusement how little I have cared about being realistic. When I submitted the manuscript, the publisher thought it was interesting and new, but wondered what classes would use it. I replied that I knew only two: a course I was teaching and one in another university. The publisher felt I had made a grave mistake in not writing a text which would fit courses already being given. He was dubious that he could sell 2000 copies, which would be necessary to break even. It was only when I said I would take it to another publisher that he decided to make the gamble. I don't know which of us been more surprised at its sales. 70,000 copies to date and still continuing. Recent years. I believe that from this point to the present time, my professional life, 5 years at Ohio State, 12 years at University of Chicago and 4 years at the University of Wisconsin, is quite well documented by what I have written. I will very briefly stress two or three points which have some significance for me. I have learned to live increasingly deep therapeutic relationships with an ever widening range of clients. This can be and has extremely rewarding. This can be and has been extremely rewarding. It can be and has been at times very frightening when a deeply disturbed person seems to demand that I must be more than I am in order to meet his needs. Certainly, the carrying on of therapy is something which demands continuing personal growth on the part of therapist. And this is sometimes painful, even though in the long run rewarding. I would also mention the steadily increasing importance which research has come to have for me. Therapy is the experience in which I can let myself go subjectively. Research is the experience in which I can stand off and try to view this rich subjective experience with objectivity, applying all the elegant methods of science to determine whether I have been deceiving myself. The conviction grows in me that we shall discover laws of personality and behavior which are as significant for human progress or human understanding as the law of gravity or the law of thermodynamics. In the last 2 decades, I have become somewhat more accustomed to being fought over, but the reactions to my ideas continue to surprise me. From my point of view, I have felt that I have always put forth my thought in tentative manner to be accepted or rejected by the reader or the student. But at different times and places, psychologists, counselors, and educators have been moved to great wrath, scorn, and criticism by my views. As this furor has tended to die down in these fields, it has in recent years been renewed among psychiatrists, some of whom sense in my way of working a deep threat to many of their most cherished and unquestionable principles. And perhaps the storms of criticism are more than matched by the damage done by uncritical and unquestioning disciples, individuals who have acquired something of a new point of view for themselves and have gone forth to do battle with all the sundry using as weapons for both inaccurate and accurate understanding of me and my work. I have found it difficult to know at times whether I have been hurt more by my friends or by my enemies. Perhaps partly because of troubling business of being struggled over, I have come to value highly the privilege of getting away, of being alone. It has seemed to me that my most fruitful periods of work are the times when I have been able to get completely away from what others think, from professional expectation and daily demands, and gain perspective on what I am doing. My wife and I have found isolated hideaways in Mexico and in Caribbean where no one knows I am a psychologist, where painting, swimming, snorkeling, and capturing some of the sceneries in color photography are my major activities. Yet in this spot, where no one more than 2 or 4 hours a day goes for professional work, I have made most of whatever advances I have made in the last few years. I prize the privilege of being alone.